Good evening. I am a member of the board of the Friends of the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park. We are sponsoring this author event tonight with Patricia Walsh Chadwick. We thank you all for attending. The mission of the Friends is to promote and further the goals of the library and the park. Fortunately, our summer book sale will not be held this year. It's being suspended, so I think it's preferred to use that phrase. We may have it in a different format. And in lieu of that, we're holding other means to make the public aware of the Friends, the library, and the park. And we're sponsoring this particular event this evening. We're very pleased to have Ms. Chadwick with us. As Bethany mentioned, part of the proceeds tonight from book sales will be donated to the library and park by the Savoy Bookstore and Cafe here in Westerly. We wish to acknowledge and to thank the Savoy Bookstore for its generosity. We also invite you to become members of the Friends. There are various member categories and contribution levels. It's quite easy to become a member. You go on the Westerly Library website, go to the drop-down menu, hit Friends, and there you are. Recently, we want you to know that the Friends have contributed to many needs that the library has. For example, the new outdoor book drop, which was much more expensive than I ever anticipated. The self-checkout, children's programming, and a very useful tool for nonprofits called Foundation Online, which I understand is now available remotely through the internet. So I encourage any of you who are involved with nonprofits to become familiar with that online tool. The Friends are very pleased to sponsor this event with Patricia Walsh Chadwick, talking about her debut book, Little Sister, a Memoir. Patricia is a local area resident who was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1948. She's a graduate of Boston University and started her professional career in the brokerage industry at the entry level, rising to become a global partner in a major investment firm. She is also active in many charitable organizations. She is married and the mother of twin adult children. Her story is a compelling one, focusing on her younger years. Patricia is currently writing a second book, a sequel to the first one. For sure, you will find Patricia's talk amazing and very candid. To start off, I have two questions for Patricia. The first focuses on the book's title, a memoir. Perhaps you could explain to us, Patricia, what a memoir is and how that differs from an autobiography.
Much, Mary. Thank you, Bethany, Caroline, and this is a great pleasure and a great honor. In my mind, and I think there may be somewhat different definitions, a memoir is my own memories. They may not be absolutely factually correct, but they're how I remembered the story. Whereas an autobiography is really, in a sense, more a history. It needs to have its facts completely correct. But I will say that I spent a lot of time in my memoir checking my own facts. I have blessed with a great memory, but I would say to myself, now I know that this happened on a Friday in March, and it was March 25th, and I know it was a Friday, and I know I was 11 or 12 years old, so I just go back to a Google Calendar and go March 25th, 1960, what day of the week? And it came up Friday. And I went, okay, I was right about that. Did the same thing with, on numerous occasions so that I was fact checking. But in fact, someone might say to me, I remember that incident, but I remember it slightly differently from the way you've told it. And for memoir, that's fine. If it's autobiography, you need to check those facts and probably have a fact checker. But it was interesting because I went kind of looking when I was first writing, starting to write, what was the difference? And I found this very interesting statement by Gore Vidal. And he wrote, he gave his own definitions of the two genres, stating a memoir is how one remembers one's own life, while an autobiography is history requiring research, dates, and facts double-checked. So Gore Vidal and I agree. And I think, in a sense, I think memoir is also something that allows you to bring in your emotions and to contemplate and to reminisce and to analyze, whereas an autobiography, I think, doesn't necessarily give one that luxury.
That was a wonderful explanation. Thank you, Patricia. I think I even understand it much better now than I did before. The second question I have relates to the topic of grace. It seems very important to you. You begin and end your book referring to grace. What do you understand grace to be, and how did it play a role in your life, including the writing of this book?
Wow, you asked really serious questions, Mary.
Sorry.
Well, I think grace means many different things to different people. And I grew up in a very Catholic environment. So I have that Catholic notion of grace being from the catechism, an unearned gift from God, which is still hard to think about. What exactly is that? But as I was writing this book, I was very much in touch with a woman with whom I knew from infancy. She was one of the big sisters at the center. She was the only African-American in the 100 people that were at the center. She was a Radcliffe graduate at the age of 19 and had a graduate degree in education by the age of 21. And she actually taught me English in high school. She remained a nun all her life, and eventually, after the center kind of split up, she headed a Benedictine priory out in Petersham, Massachusetts. And I thought I would just read the one-page description of I met with her many, many times, and she only died 5 years ago at the age of 90. But I thought I would just read something that helped me put in perspective how I thought about grace, and it was all because of her. So it's called A Brief Meditation. The definition of grace is that free and unearned favor endowed by God. I believe in grace, although I have to admit I hadn't given it much thought until an event several years ago brought it into perspective for me. The occasion was a visit to Mother Mary Claire Vincent, OSB, Benedictine, the 75-year-old prioress of St. Scholastica Priory in Petersham, Massachusetts. She had known me all my life. We were having a quiet tea together when she suddenly took my hand and, looking into my eyes with her intense and bright black eyes, she said, "Darling, there's a special place in heaven for you on account of all your generosity." I was taken aback. I had been visiting the priory since 1985, when Mother Mary Claire, with a small group of nuns, had set up the community under the auspices of the Benedictine order. While I was assuredly not called to be a nun, much less lead a contemplative life, I adored Mother Mary Claire and came to love her band of sisters. We had a symbiotic relationship. I gave them advice on matters of finance and business and provided modest financial support. They in turn prayed for me, my intentions, and anyone for whom I asked them to pray. We were indeed family. Listening to Mother's words about my place in heaven, I answered with a chuckle, "Mother Mary Claire, what I do is nothing special. It just comes naturally to me because I love you." "Aha," she responded before I could speak another word. "Your generosity is a direct response to grace. Believe you me, that's what's so marvelous about you. You accept grace, you never reject it. For that, you will be greatly rewarded, my darling." She had silenced me, and I contemplated her words, encouraging words for someone who was far from a model Catholic, much less saintly. A place in heaven, I thought. I hoped it would be close to her. I took her reassuring words to heart and have been a believer in grace ever since. Grace received and embraced inspires the heart and soul to respond. How we respond to grace determines how we live our lives. The millions of acts of daily human kindness throughout the world are evidence of man's innate goodness in response to God's grace and favor. I like to think of grace as being granted in a variety of flavors: kindness, joy, patience. Sadly, that grace totally skipped me by. Fortitude, faith, hope, humor, and so many more. I feel blessed that the grace of generosity of spirit has imbued much of my life, and I believe that the grace of gratitude is what inspired me to write this memoir.
It's interesting for folks to know that Patricia has a website, and this particular meditation, among other writings, appears on that website. So I would encourage you to take a look and see if there are things there that will also be inspiring for you. But how did grace play a role in writing this particular memoir?
Well, I was 55 years old. I remember it very, very clearly. It was my birthday, and I was sitting with my parents. And I said to them, I look back on my childhood with a lot of pleasure. And I'm thinking about writing the stories of my childhood. And my childhood was extremely unusual, and I know quite a few of you have read the book. And so you can certainly say, well, this was not an ordinary upbringing, and there were my parents with me, and you might even say, how could your parents have let this happen to you? But the fact of the matter is, I adored my parents. I dedicated the book to them, basically saying for always letting me know that they loved me. And I was being honest with them. And while one might not be able to imagine living the life and the childhood I had, once you're in that situation, you can cope. You can more than cope. It may not be what you would ever do to someone else. You may look back with, a certain amount of anxiety over past events. But the fact of the matter is, I felt that this was a story that needed to be told, and it was not, for me, a mommy dearest story. For me, this was a love story. It was about a family that couldn't be broken, and I wanted to tell it, maybe warts and all, but in a way that the arc of the story was really about going through a trial, coming out, and having a family remain intact. Mary, you're muted again suddenly.
Sorry. When it says mute and unmute, it gets a little confusing. I think you're the kind of person and author that can just lead us now into your book and describe what you're trying to convey. I know that you want everyone to understand this very unique upbringing that you had, and for many of us, it may be difficult.
Yes, I know the story goes to a dark place at the beginning, and so that is part of the reason I wanted to make sure that the dedication sent a positive theme through the book. I must say that I just decided to write the story. I felt very strongly that the story needed to be told. There were 100 people in this community. 39 of them were children, 60 of them were adults. And I knew at the age of 55, which was now 16 years ago, that within 50 years, there would be no more eyewitnesses. And I felt it was important to have some eyewitness story. My story could only be mine. And there were therefore 199 other people who could write a story. But I could only tell mine, and I tried very hard only to do that. I did not write about other people's stories. As I was going through the book, I wrote many, many stories. The book was twice as long as it ultimately is. And I realized I plucked out stories after a while because I said, that is someone else's story. Yes, it's an important recollection of my own, but it's not for me to tell their story. Perhaps the most interesting, it took me 10 years to write the book. And I was in about year 6 or 7, which, the last couple of years were just, getting it printed and all. When my daughter came home from college, and she was about 20 years old at the time, and she said, Mom, I have 2 things to tell you. First, you need to stop everything until you finish this book. which really took me a little bit by surprise because, you know, here we're growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut, and my story is not a Greenwich, Connecticut kind of story. And there's my daughter at the age of 20, not remotely embarrassed by this story, but rather saying, I want that story out there. And then the second thing she said to me, and Mom, you have to believe one thing. You have to understand and accept one thing. You grew up in a cult. My daughter was 20 and I was, well, she was 45 when I was 45 when she was born. So I was, 65 years old. I had basically, for all intents and purposes, finished the book. And I had never thought about my childhood, about my upbringing as growing up in a cult. It was just my family. It was my story. And I took to heart what she said. But by then the book was really written and I wasn't going to go back and change it. And in fact, I'm really happy that I wrote the book without thinking of it as a cult, which I am now completely accepting of. But I think the fact of the matter was, a cult to me was Jim Jones or the Branch Davidians or, some of these really weird people out there, not me, my family, and this crazy life I grew up in. But I have accepted that, and I'm actually very happy that in writing the book, I did not think of it as a cult, because I think I might have written a different story. I might have ended up thinking I need to contrast and compare, or I might have over psychoanalyzed, even though I know some people say, why did your parents do this? We need to understand why. That's their story. They're not here anymore. But I will tell you, my mother read my entire book, every single chapter. And sadly, my father had died by the time I was really getting into writing it. And my mother said, parts of it make me sad, but it's all true and you need to publish it. So it was very, very gratifying to have her blessing in publishing it. The other thing that came home to me, which again goes back to the issue of grace. So there were 39 children, and every single one of us was separated from our parents. Every one of us brought up in this very, very strict environment. Not allowed to speak to our parents, sometimes for months and months and months at a time. And yet we saw them every day. And my parents were Sister Elizabeth Ann and Brother James Aloysius. That was what I called them. Everyone else had the names for their own parents. And when my book came out, I was a little bit anxious that the other 38 children, except unfortunately 6 of them had died already, so 30 children, I was wondering, I was anxious about how they would feel about the book. And more than 2/3 of them have come to me and said, thank you for writing this book. And for me, that came home as a grace to write the book. It came into my head. I didn't quite know how to deal with it up front. I had to learn the craft of writing. That was a wonderful challenge. I got so much emotional and moral support from the women in my writing group. But for my family, as far as I was concerned, I may have been the oldest of 5 children, and therefore there were 7 of us, but I was really one of 100 people. And for these other kids to come and say, thank you for writing this book. And what it opened up for me was the realization of how much PTSD they had suffered. And some of them have been in therapy and still are in therapy, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I feel very, very fortunate and very lucky that I have not suffered, at least I don't feel I have suffered from PTSD. And again, maybe that was just a blessing that I had. I was resilient. I was tossed out. I had to survive. I knew that, I couldn't fail. Failure was not an option for me. I had no idea what success was, but I just kind of soldiered on. But to have so many of the children be so appreciative has been for me just perhaps the highlight of writing the book.
Bethany, do we have questions from our attendees?
We don't have any questions in the chat, but
I have a question. Patricia,
Yes.
this is Nina. Hi.
Hi.
As you were writing this book, did it make you feel any differently about your childhood?
You know, that's really interesting because the antagonist in the story is obviously Sister Catherine.
Right.
And, you know, she was my godmother. She ruled the place with an iron hand. I wanted her to love me. I never thought I could earn her love. She then tossed me out at the age of 17. Never reached out to me again, never wrote me a letter, never inquired as to how I was doing, then died 2 years later. And I remember, as I write in the book, going to her funeral up in Still River and basically kneeling in front of her casket and saying, "You're gone. You're gone for good." And obviously there was a certain pent up anger
Right.
about what she had done, you know, to me, my family, my life, whatever, at that point in time. But as I wrote the book, in some ways, I became even more angry with her. And in other ways, I thought, what must she have gone through to have ended up to be such a tortured human being? And I find myself in a way wishing I could speak to her and say, did something horrific happen to you in your childhood that led you to feel that this was the way you needed to construct life for everyone else? So there's a certain sense that maybe she went through something traumatic and it impacted her that way. That being said, I must say that, you know, I can speak for my family. I'm one of 5. And so many of the other children, they've all gone out from the center. They're married, they have children, they have grandchildren, they have wonderful relationships. And so the fact that, you know, one went through this truly torturous existence of not being able to have a real family life, fortunately and fabulously, did not prevent the 39 of us from turning around and making wonderful marriages and wonderful, I'm not saying everybody's still married, one of my own siblings is divorced, but having wonderful marriages, really great relationships with children and grandchildren. And so I think that the human spirit can overcome an awful lot. And for me, I've kind of sailed through the difficult parts. And now I'm with great peace with the book, with the spirit of the book, and particularly with the benefit that it had for the others. Hi, yes.
Patricia, this may be a personal question, but you have 2 children of your own. Did you feel that in raising your children, there was some affect or something that you would do that might have been different from others who had not had this experience in raising their children?
For sure, for sure. I mean, I know that there's this notion in psychology, you either repeat, you know, when people say, oh, he beats his children, well, his father beat him, kind of thing. Or you go the other direction and you get as far away from it. There were 3 things I felt that truly impacted me in bringing up my own children. And in the story, for those of you who have read it, my sister Kathy, who was a year and a half younger than I, went through a terrible, terrible time where she was so missing our parents that she wouldn't eat. She wouldn't eat for days, for which she was punished. And I was so concerned about her, not wanting her to be spanked or beaten or whatever would happen, that I would sometimes eat her meal so that her plate bowl would be clean and she could, you know, go out and play and not get beaten. And I remember when, in raising my own children, I remember early on, when they were tiny, I said to myself, food will never be an issue in this family. And, you know, we all know our children's taste buds change over time. And as a child, we had a son and a daughter, and they were twins, so they're same age, going through everything. And our son was a pretty fussy eater as a little tiny child. And Caroline was just a much more, you know, energetic eater. And I said, this is fine. They will eat what they want. What they don't want, they will not eat. And the interesting thing was that Jim loved raw vegetables, so this is great. He loved raw vegetables and hot dogs, okay? Got his carbs and he got his protein. And by the time he was a 12-year-old kid and 13 and we were off in China, he was eating the most unbelievable foods that they served in China. So food was something I would never, ever allow anyone to make an issue of. And very, very often, the four of us would be having dinner, my husband and I and the two children, and there would be four different meals on the table. It didn't bother me at all. I came to discover that that was a little bit odd. The other issue was I never saw a reason to hit a child, and I'm sure that that's a pretty common phenomenon these days. We never ever hit our children and never regretted that we didn't hit them. So that was certainly something that, you know, I was brought up with. The physical abuse was horrific. And the final thing was, so often as a child, when I would ask for something, the answer was no. And I know with children, you can't always say yes, but I would always try to find a way, if the answer had to be no, of having a little door opener so that maybe down the road, we could do something similar to what they wanted, or maybe they could get it. Though they told me for years afterwards, Mom, we were the last kids to get the fanciest toy or the new game or the this or that. And I said, well, I don't really see how you've been too damaged by that. So those were basically the three things. I know, yes, there's someone over. Oh, yes, you can talk now, yes.
I'm sorry. Patricia, you mentioned a few minutes ago about the fact that many of your compatriots had felt for the last 40 to 50 years a tremendous feeling of PTSD, and that you yourself didn't feel that. And I'm wondering if you could touch on that and regarding how you wrote this book, which in itself was cathartic. The fact that your mother blessed you for doing that, that was a state of grace there. The fact that your daughter was so on board with you. Was this something you thought about for many years, or only later in life when you thought you needed to get it out?
I hadn't thought about doing it up front. In fact, it took me, by the time I started writing the book at the age of 60, there were only 3 people in the world whom I had told the story to. That doesn't mean other people that I knew didn't know, because they knew the place and all. One was my husband. One was the man I had spent 5 or 6 years with before my husband. And one was a woman that I worked with, whom I was very close to. So once I moved to New York in 1975, and my career started to progress along a pretty normal path, as opposed to starting at the very, very bottom of the ladder. You know, I didn't find a need or a want to do it. You know, if somebody says to you, well, where did you grow up? And you go, I grew up in Chicago, and I went to this school, and then I went to college here, and then I did this. You know, it's a 3-minute, 5-minute conversation. If somebody asked me and I were to be honest and tell the truth, it would be, you know, a 500-minute conversation. And then one person would know, and they'd go, oh my God, did you ever hear her story? And it would all be about me and my story, and not about my career, and not about what I wanted to do. So it was simply easier not to talk about it. Once I started writing, and I had these wonderful women that were in my writing group, and I was always fearful that people would hate my parents. And I wasn't going to put a book out if people were going to hate my parents. And they were so encouraging. And they said, we don't hate your parents. We know whom we hate, but it is not your parents. And that gave me a great sense of relief, because I didn't want to, I wasn't out to harm them. They did what they did, and who's to know, they might have done it again. But I was not going to over-challenge them. I never fought with them about it. And you can say that's, you know, suppression or whatever, but the fact of the matter is, even writing the book did not really feel cathartic to me. There is one story in the book that was cathartic, and it is the very last story that I wrote, and it's the Me Too story that I had never, ever intended putting into the book. And it was my agent. I told him the story, and he said to me, if you're capable of writing it, write it. And then if you want to take it out, we'll simply take it out. In that case, once I wrote that story, I said, it's okay. The words were on the page, and I said, let it be. I admit, even to this day, that I don't really like people thinking about me in that horrific situation. But at the time I wrote it, the book was, just ready to go to press. And, it was early in 2017. And, the Harvey Weinstein story hadn't come out yet. So I still thought at that point that I was like 1 in 5 million. And now I realize I was probably 1 in 3. So, it was a deep, dark secret that I kept because, I didn't tell my family for 30 years. And so believe me, when I hear women coming out of the, blue or the darkness and telling their stories, I believe them. I'm not saying that every single story is true. And the story about Joe Biden certainly seems to have gone way off the rails. And we know there have been all kinds of stories like that. But in essence, most of the people that are telling those stories are telling the truth. So that to me was the truly cathartic part. I did have a gentleman, I gave a presentation at the Retired Men's Association in Greenwich. And then I had a small lunch, and one of the gentlemen on the committee said to me, do you dream about the center? I said, I dream every night about it. And I would somehow, in whatever dream I have, the center seems to fold in. Sometimes it's just the place. Other times, Sister Catherine can be in it in a perfectly, non-threatening way. But often when I wake up in the morning, if I've had a particularly zany dream, which I seem to have a lot of, I'll say to my husband, you won't believe the dream I had last night. And he'll say, who from the center was in it? And so I was telling this gentleman that story, and he said, there's been a very interesting study that's been done. I think it's contemporary study. I'm not even sure if it's completed. And I think this guy was a psychiatrist. And he said, when people have really serious incidents, be they coming back from war or a plane crash they survived or a fire or something horrific, they have discovered that the victims who dream about the incident don't tend to suffer from PTSD, but the people who block it out, even from their subconscious, and can't even dream about it, suffer from PTSD. I have no idea if that's proven. I don't have much knowledge in that whole area, but I found it interesting. And I found that the way he asked me the question was, do you dream? And I didn't know why he was asking me that. And I said, every night. And then he kind of was like an aha moment. Is that helpful?
Very, thank you.
So I think, and I don't know how long we're supposed to go. Bethany, just tell me, because I could end, or I can answer more questions if you'd like.
I think, Dan, do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Dan,
You remember me? You do remember me, right?
I do remember you. My goodness. Thank you for getting on.
I think I should say that for the audience, I'm the next generation after Patricia. I was a member of the Brothers community from 1976 until 1985. And so that was after the community had formed itself into a religious community. And so when did you actually leave, Patricia?
I was out in 1966, right after I graduated.
So you were gone in yes. But it's interesting when I hear this, I have a different outlook because I came after most of the children had already left, but the community was persisting. And I basically fell in love with the brothers that were there and the sisters that were there. And so it was helpful to me to read Patricia's book because, first of all, I knew many of the people, but secondly, I was moved by the fact that this was a charitable way of presenting the story without vilifying the wrong people, and even the right people that deserved a little bit of vilification were not handled angrily. I was happy about that because in this community there were great people. There really were. They were wonderful people that I believe that the decision makers made the bad decisions, but there were a lot of people that were there for different reasons. And I wanted them to be saved in a way. And they were. When Patricia says she looks back with a great deal of happiness on her childhood, even though I actually entered the community in 1975, but had been coming since 1971. And so I was a high school boy. I went to high school at the center, and I watched the center grow from being the community of religious and then morphing into a Benedictine community, which it is now. Although the original community is now 5 different communities at last count. At last count, it was 5.
Some of them have now.
It was, even though it might, Patricia says that it wasn't cathartic in a sense for her. For me, it was tremendously cathartic to read her story. And there's a group of us that we call ourselves the used-to-be's because we used to be in religious life and we used to be part of the center. And of those who have read the book, read Patricia's book, all of us are coming away really with goosebumps and awe because it captured a lot of the things, a lot of the emotion and a lot of the conundrum of the place, the tremendous love and yet the terrible, terrible angst and almost a fury about the place. And for me, it was almost a turning point because if I was suffering from PTSD, I didn't know it, or at least I didn't recognize it as that. But the relief I felt after reading the book was extreme because I almost thought that I had made it up, that it really wasn't real, that I had fabricated all these things and the difficulties in my head. And so to have someone finally put it down and explain how they saw this control, which exists in a cult, the control of almost kind of an Orwellian thought crime kind of thing that was happening at the center. I saw it, I felt it, but I didn't want to admit it. And I think that all of us were repelled by the notion that this was a cult, because cults, you associate a cult with Waco, Texas. The drinking Kool-Aid in the jungle. This was, however, a cult of personality, and somehow you had no choice. You were a child when you became part of it. I did have a choice in a sense, but I didn't recognize it as such. I think it had morphed a lot by the time I got there. I think it had changed. I think that it wasn't, of course, the tremendous personalities of Leonard Feeney and Sister Catherine. Leonard Feeney was still alive. Father Feeney was still alive, but he had lost his control. But that control went on to other people, and I got into it. And but I want to finish. I know I'm all over the place, but I'm trying to get back to the point that catharsis is a fruit of this book, and especially for those of us who were there or became part of it. And I know that it's had a tremendous effect, and I'm sad for those who are not reading it because they have prejudged it. My own wife, and since we're all being very frank, who was a sister at the convent, and we got together after we left and have now been married for 27 years and have a little adopted daughter. She was very reticent to read this book. She did not want to have anything to do with it. She doesn't want to think about the fact that she was there ever. She thinks it's all it's just a part of her life she didn't want to address. And slowly but surely, I was able to coerce her into reading. And she had an amazing response to the book. She was just happy that someone had finally captured so much. So it wasn't a question, I guess. But
Thank
Well,
you.
the fact of the matter is there were some brilliant people at the center. And I feel that we were all the beneficiaries of that.
Yes.
And while the cult part of the organization has that tendency, take the brilliant people and push them away because they could be intellectually challenging, et cetera, somehow, I think for all of those years, there's an osmosis. And Carrie Walsh is someone here, and she said to me, you've got to talk about, she just printed about Sister Mary Clare. Well, I actually read the very first little prelude to the book, which was my conversation with Sister Mary Clare, or Mother Mary Clare, and her talk about grace and all. And I am eternally grateful for the opportunity to have grown up with what I will call 60 uncles and aunts, many of whom were absolutely brilliant, PhDs in physics and philosophy and geology and personalities, and from Russia and from Lebanon and Spain and places like that. So I grew up in a kind of multicultural, if incredibly stringent environment. But for me, knowing all these people had these, even though we weren't allowed to talk about their past life, it just made me bursting with energy and wanting to explore the world and go to Tuscany and go to see the cedars of Lebanon and go to Egypt. And so, you can, it's kind of a little bit inside your own mind, what you can achieve on your own. But I do think that for some of the children, I mean, when the book first came out, I went to a couple of them and said, will you read the book? And one gal, she was basically my age, she said, I don't know. She said, I'll try. So a few weeks later, I called her and I said, have you read it? And she said, that first chapter when you were called into Sister Catherine's office, she said, I got so many knots in my stomach. I'm sorry, I just had to put it down. I said, okay. I said, but I do think if you are able to read it, maybe you'll find some good in it. A few weeks later, she texted me and she said, my therapist has read the book and she loves it. And she wants to talk to you. And I thought, what am I going to talk to someone's therapist about? but I think the woman wanted to just chat with me. She was lovely. We chatted for about 5 or 6 minutes. And about a week later, the gal I grew up with texted me and said, I read your book in a day and a half. And so then her sister, who had basically cut all of us off 20 years ago, said, I can't have anything to do with anyone who ever grew up there. I cannot deal with this anymore. Please take me out of your email list. Don't call me, don't do anything. So I said to her, do you think your sister might read the book? And she said, let me see. Well, long story short, about 2 weeks later, this gal asked me to friend her on Facebook, and she and I talk every week. And that in and of itself really makes me emotionally happy, because we were all so tight as children. I mean, you know, we were a pack, and everybody had to deal with the emotional trauma that they had. And for some it was never talk to me about it again. But somehow when the book was able to bring us back, for me, that was the best. So I think if there are a couple of questions, oh, I see Susan here too. Hey. But I thought I might just read the afterword, which, as Mary started off by saying, also kind of deals with the issue of grace. Is that okay, Bethany?
Yes, yep. And if I don't know if you want to just take 2 minutes to talk about maybe the new book you're.
Of course, yes. Let me do that. Well, so there's a woman who's listening right now, and her name is, well, I just know her as Susan Mullen, but she was Susan Elliott Harburger Mullen, and she was my dearest friend, and we were roommates in Philadelphia. And we were roommates in Philadelphia, and she knew my parents, and she did not know this story. And so, because she and I met when I was still a secretary at Ladenburg Thalmann, and I was given the great honor of taking her out to lunch because she was a significant client of the firm. And I remember taking her to lunch at the Ritz-Carlton, and we didn't talk business. I mean, what business were we supposed to talk about? We just talked about the people we were dating. And we became such good friends. And when she was offered a job in Philadelphia, I think I was 23 at the time. And she said, I'm moving to Philadelphia, will you come with me? And I said, yes. I went off to Philadelphia, didn't even have a job. You can do that when you're 23 years old. And went and had an interview the very next day, was offered a job. And to this day, Susan and I are just incredibly good friends. And she had a wonderful event for me up on the Cape last summer. And so it's just fabulous to see her here. But my book is really about life after the center. So the current book, Little Sisters, 3/4 of it is really about growing up. And about 1/4 of it is just like, how did you move on? But in fact, I really did start out as the receptionist, which is about the lowest, rung on the ladder. It was kind of the luck of the Irish, if you can say that. I was, had 2 opportunities to go and have an interview. And one was at the Atlantic Monthly, which is called the Atlantic Monthly back then. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that would be great. Maybe this will give me an opportunity to get an education, because I was allowed to go to secretarial school, but not given any opportunity to go to college. And the other was this place called Ladenburg Thalmann, which sounded like some German company to me. But that was my first interview. And I went in and they offered me the job. And I didn't know how to say no. I mean, what if the other place didn't offer me the job? And so I said yes. And I started off at $90 a week as the receptionist. And the rest is history. But it's, both Susan and I were growing up on Wall Street at a time where there were no women role models. And there were hardly any women. And for me, it was just an exciting adventure. I had, looking back on it, some of the most wonderful mentors, all men, not surprisingly. And I think, and then if you grow up on Wall Street, okay, there are a lot of crazy and funny things that happen And I won't tell everything, Susan, I promise you. But, you know, I hope it will be fun. I hope it will be helpful, perhaps particularly to young women who are, you know, looking. I mentor a lot of women today. I mentor people. I mentor college kids. I mentor middle school girls at Our Lady Queen of Angels School in Harlem. And so many young women will say to me, I can't find a female mentor. And I say, don't choose your mentor. Mentoring is a coming together of two people. You're looking for something and someone's being generous with their time and their abilities. Don't pick your mentor. And I always tell people there'll be many mentors in your life. And it's only when you look back on, you know, the path of your life that you'll realize how wonderful they were and how many they were. So I hope it will be a fun, enjoyable, slightly zany book, but I hope it will also continue on with kind of the purpose of what I feel is sharing the good things in life and you know, helping other people. Is that helpful, Bethany?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let me finish up by just reading the afterword of my book. Friends have asked me why I'm not angry, why I don't hate my parents, and why I seem so normal. I think my friends might say I'm not quite so normal, but that's okay. To be honest, I have spent little time analyzing why I am happy. That is not to imply that I have been free of any anger, rather that the anger I have felt has been directed not at my parents, but at Catherine Clark. From an early age, I had a subliminal conviction that my parents were somehow victims of the powerful Leonard Feeney and Catherine Clark. It appeared to me that my parents, my siblings, and I were thrust together in a world that was foreign to our kinship. With the benefit of adulthood and maturity, I came to realize that my parents were free to have left the center and thus to have prevented our family from being sundered. They allowed their religious zealotry to supersede their parental obligations and the joys associated with them. When I try to understand why my parents did what they did, I cannot. I could never have made such a sacrifice, nor do I pretend that I didn't wish my childhood had been different. Those endless hours consumed craving family life, wondering if we were the only 39 children in the whole world who were being raised in a religious order forbidden to call our parents mommy and daddy. This incomprehension is real, as is the pain. What anger I have experienced is aimed fully at Catherine Clark, the power behind the throne of Leonard Feeney. Tall and powerful, she exuded an Amazonian force. As a mere child, I was her challenge, unmalleable, a free spirit in the claustrophobic world of the center. She and I engaged in a battle of the wills, and try as she might, she was unable to forge me into a submissive member of the community. And so she banished me. At the time, I felt like a failure, but in truth, it was she who had failed. I was David to her Goliath. Despite the pain and the anger, I am most conscious of the many ways in which I have been blessed, not the least of which is that I'm hardwired to tackle challenges, disappointments, humiliations, and other hurdles in life. I'm an optimist through and through. No matter how bad the news or how daunting the situation, my instinct is to create a solution and see it through to make the situation right again. I left the center at the tender age of 17, brokenhearted and feeling deserted. But that door through which I was kicked out was the same door that opened onto a world I had so passionately wanted to explore since I was a small child. The optimist in me seized the opportunity to learn, silently and timidly at first, and to vault forward on the expedition of my life. Some ventures were formidable, but the journey has been extraordinarily fulfilling. There simply has been no time for self-pity. If I let myself dwell on the emotional pain I experienced, I would unfairly ignore all the good that God's grace has showered on me, not the least of which is the blessing associated with raising my own children in a warm and loving family environment. Happiness is finding peace, joy, and inspiration in the array of things one does in life. It is also moving on from what cannot be undone. I am thankful for the grace that allowed me to find a way forward, uninhibited by remorse and anger. And I will just end with one little story. At the end of one of my presentations, a gentleman raised his hand and said to me, "What, if anything, would you change in your life today as you look back?" And you have to answer quickly. You can't just sit around and think for 10 minutes. And I thought to myself quickly, I'm immensely happy. I have a husband whom I married 35 years ago and would marry again tomorrow. I have 2 children whom I adore, and I am, so proud of, as so many of us are proud of all of our children. I have a wonderful life. I've traveled. I've had a great career. I can hardly think of anything I've really wanted to do in my life that I haven't done. And I thought quickly, if I changed one thing in my past, the path of my life might have changed in a way, and I wouldn't be where I am today. And so I said, with great comfort and great ease, I would not change a single thing in my life. And I really feel that way. Thank you. Thank you very much for letting me share this with you. I appreciate so many friends coming, so many people coming who already heard me talk, and I hope it was helpful to see it again. Thank you, Nina, for being here. So many people.